In this lecture series, we'll be looking at the 1920s in American history, and we'll actually be focusing on 1920 all the way up until 1932 as we look at the Roaring Twenties, the post-war years that were actually a time of economic prosperity for many Americans, all the way up until the economy reaches a screeching halt with the onset of the Great Depression. Now, this is still a time of divisions and disparities in American history, so even though it's a period of economic prosperity for many Americans, there are still also many Americans who experience economic hardships during this time and limited economic opportunity, and we'll especially see that as we continue to examine the Black American experience and the experiences of immigrants as well during this time. Now, obviously, anything that can be said of economic disparities during this time can also be said of social and political disparities, and we see that with segregation, with Jim Crowism, restrictions on Black liberty, particularly in the South, and we see even racial violence. There's a resurgence of the KKK during the 1920s as well. So even though we kick off the 1920s with the ratification and adoption of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which extends suffrage to all Americans regardless of sex, now women throughout the United States have the ability to vote, we still see groups who are being marginalized and minoritized and whose access to political participation is being restricted, whether that be participating politically at the polls through voting or their ability to actually run for office and hold office as well. Another segment of American society and culture where we find divides during the 1920s is religion versus secularism, or even fundamentalist religiosity versus more liberal religiosity. And really, this is a response to a changing American culture, especially in the urban centers where cultural pluralism is planting roots, essentially, and people are more accepting now of new ideas and new cultural practices that challenge the nativist norm, and where women are challenging traditional gender roles and accepting more liberal sexual and social attitudes, where consumerism is on the rise and people are spending more money on material goods or leisure activities, or even in the schools where the curriculum was up for grabs when it comes to religion versus secularism, as some teachers in some schools were adopting Darwin's theory of evolution, which contradicted the biblical story of creation. All of these things causes a fundamentalist surge in American culture and American society, where biblical literalists are pushing back against these changes and this liberalization, not just in society and in culture, but in many churches as well. We'll take a look at, the evangelism that was taking place during this time from the fundamentalist side, and we'll also see fundamentalism versus secularism in the Scopes monkey trial, which deals with evolution in the schools. And finally, we also see a change in Washington's attitudes and policies toward business and labor. So we see Washington really recede back into a laissez-faire approach in a lot of ways to allow the economy to just grow on its own with minimal regulation and minimal interference. And as a result, we see a decline in labor during the 1920s. And it does result in economic growth, and things look good for a while for a lot of Americans until the end of the 1920s, when a lot of factors catch up to the American economy and result in economic decline and, again, the onset of the Great Depression. This series will be broken up into several different lectures covering different subtopics to allow you to listen to the different subtopics within this series individually and take it in smaller doses, and then also go back and revisit any one of these subtopics without having to navigate your way through the entire series. So the subtopics that we will be covering in this series include the business of America, business and government, the birth of civil liberties, the culture wars, and the Great Depression. And of course, as always, as you listen to these lectures or after reviewing the entire series, if you have any questions regarding any of the content, please feel free to email me, or you can post your question to the coffee shop discussion board in Canvas so that your peers can get involved in a discussion around that question as well.